Hey everyone, my name is Will, and in this video I want to share with you a very simple but highly effective workflow for processing your landscape raw files. Look, it's one of those things where we can be out in nature capturing a dynamic sunrise or sunset, and I hear so many times people say that their phone takes a better photo than their expensive camera. I understand the frustration with this, and that's because the smartphones, they have a built-in algorithm which is doing all the editing for you instantaneously. But of course, with our raw files, we need to do the work ourselves. But therein lies the problem, especially if you're just starting out, it can be very daunting. So the workflow that I show you here, it applies in Lightroom as well as Photoshop. It's very easy. All you need to do is just start practicing and applying it. And I'm pretty confident you're going to get results that you're after. So let's have a look. I've got a beautiful sunset scene here at Milford Sound. This was quite recent on a workshop I was running. You can see by the phone video what it looks like. It looks beautiful, but you'll see when we bring the raw file up how dark it is, how flat it is, and that's because I was shooting to protect the highlights, knowing that I'd reveal the darker tones later on. So let's take a look. Alright, I've opened up the raw file here in Photoshop, and Photoshop then gives us Camera Raw, which is still part of Photoshop, so don't think it's a separate product or anything like that. If you're a Lightroom user, you're going to see that it is almost identical, so it's perfect. It doesn't matter which program you use for your processing, the workflow is pretty much the same thing. Alright, whenever I open up a raw file, I basically develop a quick little game plan in my head. When you're first starting out, you might really want to maybe write it down or have a bit of a process in order. It gets easier the more you do it, obviously. For this one here, it's quite simple really what I want to do. I need to brighten everything up so I can see those details. Bring back the color that we had, and the color's there, but it's just obviously not as vibrant as what it was to the eye. And then I need to create the depth and push the eye through to that background, and I do that by manipulating the brights and darks and essentially the tonal range, the contrast, in order to make those mountains in the distance appear further back than the foreground here, for example. And this is the hardest thing with photography in these raw files. Instantly, you know, especially if you're shooting a bit dark like this to protect those highlights, all our dark tones are very much the same throughout the frame, very heavy in the front, very heavy in the back, but that's just not how nature works. We have the atmospheric perspective in nature where, you know, essentially anything far off in that distance, and we can see it here in the valley, this far distance here is more of a blue and it's far lighter than what's in the front. And that's just the atmospheric perspective. Look at the raw file though, it's really hard to see all that. And if you go grabbing the contrast slider and increasing that globally, you're making those distant tones get darker and darker, and you instantly lose that three-dimensional feel. So let me show you how we can keep that in mind. We're just going to run through step by step and apply a workflow which I use on almost all of my work. So when it comes to the color profile at the top, I'll often, not always, but I'll often throw it on landscape. See, straight away it just slightly adjusts the dynamic range. Watch the histogram, ready? So slightly increases the shadows, decreases the highlights, tiny touch of saturation and vibrance there to the color. Why not apply it? Just apply it. If you like it, cool. If not, take it off. Sometimes it might go overboard, just depends on the raw file. Now for the brightening part, nice and easy. I'm going to bring up exposure. Now as I do this, it means that I'm bringing up every tone evenly, and that's what I want. If I just do shadows, for example, the problem with that is in the foreground here, especially on the edge of the sand, there's more than just shadows. There's highlights, there's midtones. When you just do one tone only, like shadows, we start to get a real artificial type look because you're lifting one tone and leaving the rest. That's why I'll often, if I need to brighten, do a global exposure. So global means we're doing the whole raw file. This is all global adjustments at the moment. Now I'm doing global on exposure. Now one of the downsides, of course, which you've probably noticed, is that our sky is just getting way too bright. And we're going to address that in a minute, okay, locally. For now, let's just get the global work done. I will do a little bit of highlight recovery, and that is helping the sky, but I'm not going to go overboard because it's then going to start removing too much of the nice highlights that we have down here in the midground and foreground, okay? So let me just zoom back out. Let's do a slight highlight recovery. Again, we'll hit the sky locally in a minute. Now, if the shadows, it could be just a little lift as well, but for us to really get back here, we'll do a local adjustment also. So already we've done 3 things, and look at the difference to the dynamic range, okay? Look at the histogram, quite bright. Now we're starting to balance out those tones. Now I need to straighten this up. It's driving me crazy. So let's click the crop tool in the top right-hand corner. Where it says angle here, I just highlight those numbers, the degrees, and I push up or down on the keyboard until I see that straighten up, and we'll go somewhere around there. Okay, now I just push the edit button up the top, and that's fixed that. All right, I'm sure that was driving some of you guys crazy as well. All right, so we've started to fix the exposure, the dynamic range, and this is what an iPhone would do for you with its algorithms built in. What about the color? What about leading the eye and creating the depth? Those other things that we want to approach. First of all, I might tackle some of the color. If we open up the color tab, funny enough, that's what they call it. It's exactly what we need. We've got the temperature and tint. Sometimes I will adjust these. Now keep in mind these are global, so if you want to warm up the sky and you start increasing, keep in mind you're now warming up the foreground. What's nice about this moment is the natural color contrast we have, and you get this at sunrise and sunsets quite often. We have cooler shadows, cooler midtones, and then you'll have warmer highlights. It's very pleasing on the eye. We really want to run with that and keep that in mind as we're processing here. So I might leave the temperature and tint for the moment. Let's jump down to the vibrance and saturation. Now, the vibrance is more working on your midtones, and the saturation is the shadows and highlights. So it means you can generally go a little heavier on vibrance than what you might on the saturation. So generally I might be anywhere from 10 to 30 on the vibrance. Saturation, I'm going to leave it about 5, okay? The other part of color that I want to talk about is the color grading down here. And this is where we can really start to locally adjust colors and tones throughout the frame. So like I said, warm highlights is very pleasing. What we can do now in our grading is directly approach that. So the outer circle is the hue, the color tone that we want. So let's warm the highlights. So I've gone to the highlight wheel and pick a warm hue. And now to apply the saturation to that highlight, we need to click this inner circle and drag it outwards. And as we drag it outwards, we're applying the saturation. I'm going to hold shift. That'll put that black line. That means the wheel won't move around onto a different hue. I'm going to go overboard so you can see what's going on, but see the sky, if you just look there, so up and down, you can see that. So let's apply a little bit of warming to those highlights like so. Now, if we wanted to, we could actually have a look at the midtones. Maybe we want to cool those down. So I'm just watching what happens there. Maybe you want to warm those up, or maybe you want to leave them. There's no right or wrong, especially if midtones, sometimes, you know, you'll be surprised what you may end up preferring. Shadows I'll often have cool, but the mids just depends on the image. I'm just going to leave it for now actually, and I'm going to leave the shadows too. We can always come back to this part later on if we want to. Let's get into the fun stuff though. The local adjustments, let's really lead the eye and create a 3-dimensional feel in that distance, a more atmospheric look, and really pull the eye through the frame. So how do I like to do it? If we click the masking button up here, what this does, it gives you different tools to work locally on the image. The only one I use is the brush. The shortcut is K. I'm going to push that, and that's it. Well, I'm not going to talk about the other ones because I don't use them. And yes, of course you can if you want to, but I just don't need to use them in my workflow. I just like the brush, and it does everything I need. The other thing is when you use the brush now, I like to set the feather, flow, and density to 100. Especially the feather is the critical part. It just means that we get a soft brush. So when we apply something, you're not seeing a hard edge anywhere. The first thing now is let's darken that top part of the sky in order to push the eye back to the center of the frame. So what you do is all these adjustments now will apply to the edge of our adjustment brush. I'm going to bring down the exposure slightly, say half a stop, maybe some highlights as well. You just have a guess what you want to apply. Brush it and then adjust accordingly. I don't brush first. I prefer to have something on my brush and watch in real time the result it's doing. It's much more intuitive that way. So I'm just darkening that top part of the sky. Let me turn that on and off over here. On, off, okay? I'm going to push K. That gives me a new brush. This time I'm going to bring out the light in the center. Let's really pull the eye through. What I'm going to do is bring up the exposure. let's say half a stop, and just start to bring up the details all back here. Now exposure, I need to be careful because I don't want to blow out that sky. So even if we go 0.4, then I'll lift the shadows, which is going to help with those mountains. Maybe the blacks a little bit. Remember, we're trying to create that atmospheric perspective, set these mountains further away than the midground and foreground. And why don't we warm it up back there? Because look at that, that's where that beautiful golden light is. So a lot of my processing is just looking what's already in the raw file and then bringing it out. We're not adding anything to the file, we're just working with what we've got, okay? So let me turn that brush on and off, before, after. I'm going to show you one more thing with that. Push K for a new brush. If we really want to enhance the light back there, another thing that I'll often do is a slight amount of exposure, some warming, so a little bit of yellow and magenta, and then I'll rehaze. So rehaze, it's like adjusting the mid-tone contrast, and it just creates the illusion of almost like a hazy light, but essentially what that is, it's just helping press it further back into the distance with that atmospheric perspective, which I've mentioned probably more than enough times now, okay? So it's looking further away and like it's set off in the distance because those dark tones are nowhere near as dark as what's in front of it, okay? So you can see the rehazing, what that does back there, all right? Okay, what about the foreground? In the foreground, I'll push K for a new brush. This is where I'll go heavier on the contrast, all right? Darker darks. Increase the contrast, and I might bring the whites up too, and I'll show you why I've done that, but let's just hit this with contrast first. This needs to be darker. It's closer to the viewer, and by being darker, it's going to help push the eye back to the distance. We don't want to sit on anything dark. We want to travel to the light. I might even dehaze now. So not rehazing, dehazing. See what that's doing? Now the reason why I've done contrast and dehaze and not exposure is I want to make sure that I'm keeping these beautiful golden edges bright. So if we did exposure and darkened everything down, the whole thing would become dark. So we've done contrast and dehaze to make the darker tones darker, the brighter tones get brighter. Okay. Looking at the image now, so it's important to just step back every now and then and reassess everything. Come back with fresh eyes even. So when I'm filming a tutorial, you know, sitting down, you're doing it in one sitting, you're not always going to get the final result. I recommend, probably at the point I'm at now, just save this, come back later with fresh eyes, and you'll kind of see what the last few adjustments need to be. I'm thinking the color, the image looks maybe a little bit, for lack of a better word, washed out. So too much of a mid-tone. If we want to adjust that globally, you could open the curves panel, and then here's our histogram. We could grab the darks and bring these down so you can really see how much that's dramatizing things. The downside is though, remember, that's going to apply to those mountains back there, which we don't necessarily want. So maybe in this case, I'd go local again, and I would just dehaze, which is like a mid-tone contrast, kind of what we just did on the curves. I'll hit the sky up there. Otherwise, I'll reset that. You can open the curves and work on the curves on the brush as well. So I could pick a dark tone back here and pull that down. You see what the sky's doing? If you wanted to, you could then lift the brighter tones up slightly. In regards to color, I still feel like we could probably get a bit more in there if we want to. Going back to the color panel globally, increasing the magenta slightly, and slight increase here in the temperature, but I'm going to go back to the grading, and I'm not sure I'm happy with that hue that we selected. So I might bring that further down into the orange and reds, instead of being a pastel orange, pastel yellow, and just apply that in there. Now when we get into the mids, I think this is where we might want to actually warm. Do we want to warm those up? No, not quite. I'm still going to leave them. Let's go into the shadows after all and just cool those slightly. That's doing wonders down there in the foreground. About there. Now, if you are processing away and you're working in a workflow like this, and you see something that you think, oh, I don't know if I like what I've done here or there, the good thing is about working with these local adjustments is it's got a history right here. So it's like layers basically. If I turn them all off, that's without any local adjustments. That's putting them all back in. But you can always run back and go, you know what, I think I've overdone X, Y, Z. So even that one, I think I've probably actually gone a bit heavy. So I'm going to click it now, and then I'm going to run down to whatever the adjustment was. It was rehazing. I think I just went a bit too heavy there. So I'm going to dial it back to about that point there. Let's just do a before and after now, see what we've come from. So that's where we were with the original RAW. That's where it's at now. If I push Q, and give us a side-by-side comparison. It's a big difference, and really what we've done is simply just lightened and darkened certain parts of the image in order to help direct the eye, reveal the details. When it comes to the color, we just brought out the colors that were already naturally there. Very simple and effective. Another thing that I can show you as well, if we push K for a new brush, if you bring up some whites on a brush, this is a good way to just boost any light in a really subtle way. So I'll show you as I turn this back and forward. Ready? Watch, see what that's doing. So if you ever have some subtle details in the frame, and even back here on the mountains, for example, we've got these little areas where the trees have come down and there's just a tonal difference, but it's just all kind of washed out. If you bring the whites up, it'll just help you very subtly get some separation back there. So let's turn that on and off. Ready? Okay. Now I've purposely gone over the edge there. So when I use the brush, I will not specifically use a small brush and try and stay within the lines. When you do that, you'll end up going over and create a halo, a little golden, a little glow around the edges where you've maybe slipped over, and then you can see the brush strokes. It's better off just using a larger brush. Remember, it's high feather, so the edge of the brush will not have a very big percentage of whatever your adjustment is. So if you go outside the line, it's not really going to be noticeable, but by going over the line on purpose, it just fuses and blends it together quite seamlessly. Going back into the color panel globally, I wonder if we can just increase the vibrance more, about 25, saturation 10, and what do we want to do? Bring down the global exposure, I think. One last blast of light. As I darken everything down then, I like the result, except I think I want that light a bit stronger in the back. So exposure, temperature warmer, slight rehazing, not as strong as before though. And just kind of lift all the tones back here. Before and after, okay, just something like that. Now, we're really in the zone here of needing to let this marinade. Save it as a TIFF, save it as a PSD, whatever you want. Come back later with fresh eyes, you'll make some subtle adjustments. But hopefully now, that's just given you a very strong fundamental lesson in how to use Photoshop here in ACR, still Photoshop, so you don't have to fear Photoshop. Or if you're a Lightroom user, you can do all this in Lightroom as well. Adjustment brush, it's the only tool that we used. We had a game plan. Typically that game plan is very similar. Let's reveal the details, create that three-dimensional feel by tonal separation. Lighter here, darker there, so on and so forth. When it comes to the colors, color grading, you can use a brush, warm up the white balance in specific areas. These raw files can be so flat, especially when you're shooting that backlight like I was in this scenario. It's very fun light to photograph. It's very easy to draw the eye through when you've got that light and that glow in the background. But yes, the raw files will be pretty horrendous. And this is where something like a smartphone will do a pretty good job because it has that built-in algorithm and editing function. Most people just assume the phone is, you know, not editing at all, but it is. It's just how it is, all right? So hopefully that helps you guys. Hopefully it demystifies a lot of things. Don't be intimidated. Go grab a raw file, try practice some of this workflow now, and don't go watching too many tutorials because the workflow here, you could do this 50 different ways, beyond 50 different ways, but you don't need to know that many ways. Just find a workflow that makes sense to you, that you enjoy, and start practicing. And stop watching multiple YouTube tutorials because it's just going to make your head spin and you're not going to really get results unless you're just out here practicing over and over, and then you can make it your own. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you so much for watching the video. Your support means a lot. Please leave any questions below. I'll always get back to you. Otherwise, I'll see you in another video shortly. Cheers.